Mao prevails in that civil war. This was not something that would have been expected. Chiang has the support of the United States. He has the support of many international players, financial support. They were funneling him money and priority over decades. And Mao succeeds. So I want you to keep that in mind. Mao rules China from 1949 when he successfully causes Chiang to flee to Formosa or Taiwan. And he lives until 1976. And it is going to be a wild ride, so to speak, Mao's China. He implements a number of programs, and here's why that's significant, just to kind of couch this in world history terms. Very rarely do you get a successful revolution to happen in a nation of as many people that live in China. Hundreds of millions of people in a very short instance fall under the grip of, Mao's economic, political, and social programs. So that is the context which we're going to be examining in Mao's China. I want to start with this picture that was taken at some time around the period of the Long March that you read about in Rival Chinese Leaders. This is Mao prominently in the center. It's a famous picture of him. Him in his prime, you might say. He's flanked by one of his major lieutenants, a guy named Zhou Enlai, who's going to become a big political figure, especially in the 1970s as China reaches out to the United States and others. But I wanted to lead with this picture because remembering Mao like this is how a lot of the Chinese people would have seen Mao. He was the legend who escaped Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist forces. He made that long march. He did all of those things against all odds, and he triumphed and prevailed and became leader of China when the odds were not stacked in his favor. So in the future, when Mao asks people to do something, when he tells the Chinese peasant population, we need to make this happen, not only does Mao believe it's possible because he's done it before, a lot of the Chinese population is going to look at him as this historical, legendary figure, and they're going to say, yeah, we want to do it. We're on board, Chairman Mao. So keep that background, that early life experience in mind. I want to lead with a quote here that Mao gives in 1945. So the Chinese Civil War isn't even over. Chiang has not even been defeated yet. And I want us to just briefly analyze this quote and to generate a summary sentence from it. And I want to give you some context to it as well. This is a speech Mao gives in 1945, and he says here, "Today, two big mountains lie like a dead weight on the Chinese people. One is imperialism, the other is feudalism. The Chinese Communist Party has long made up its mind to dig them up. We must preserve and work unceasingly, and we too will touch God's heart. Our God is none other than the masses of the Chinese people. If they stand up and dig together with us, why can't these two mountains be cleared away?" Now, just to give you a little bit of extra context here as you analyze this. This calls upon a legend that would have been common to many Chinese villagers and people in the countryside. It's like a myth. It's a legend of a Chinese peasant who wants two mountains removed from near his farm. And he commits himself in an almost ridiculous way to digging them away. I mean, how are you going to dig away mountains? But in the story of this, in this mythology, the peasant commits himself to it, and it impresses the gods, and they intervene on his behalf, and they move the mountains. And the peasant is thus rewarded. They do so because he believes the mountains can be moved, and by Mao telling this story, he's connecting with this early kind of mythological past with the Chinese people. So here's what I want you to do. Convert this to one summary sentence. What's Mao saying needs to be done? Take a minute or two. Generate a summary sentence. What's he basically saying? You talk with a partner, do whatever you have to do, succinctly put something together. Mr. Bernardi's carefully going over the seating chart. We're going to hear from a number of you. Accomplish in that quote. So this is largely review. Don't feel like you need to get all of this down, but especially those of you who were in class on Friday. But I want to give you a vision for what China looks like when Mao takes power. We know that it had been ravaged by decades of civil war. Mao versus Chiang, that goes back to the 1920s, throughout the 1930s, the Long March. Then World War II happens, the Japanese occupation. You saw some of the imagery from the rape of Nanjing in World War II, what the Japanese soldiers do. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to be killed in these instances. Extreme trauma has been visited on the people of China. 4/5 of the population of China that Mao walks into, that Mao inherits in 1949, they live as subsistence farmers. We're not talking about big commercial agricultural operations that produce lots of food. We're talking about small-scale, hand-to-mouth existence, small plots of land and rice paddies only serving enough for your family and village. That's it. That's the majority of the population. Almost no middle class. Limited education. There's no state system of schools that can be brought to people in the rural areas of China. Financial problems. One of the things that Chiang does is he takes most of China's gold reserves with him when he flees to Taiwan. So the whole financial structure and architecture of China is thrown into chaos. Banks, lending, credit, all up in the air. Mao faces hostility from the United States right off the bat, and this is understandable. The United States spent multiple decades supporting Chiang, bestowing upon him millions of dollars, all sorts of financial and military support. And now Mao pulls off the miracle, defeats Chiang. The United States is not going to look upon Mao as friendly. After all, remember, this happens in 1949. This is the start of the Cold War. The moment the U.S. is devising its plans to contain the spread of communism and the Soviet Union, the most populated nation in the world falls into the arms of communism. From the United States perspective, this is the worst thing that could happen. The fact that Mao prevails in China. In fact, it's going to be a huge political firestorm in the United States. President Harry Truman is going to be blamed for losing China. And he's going to be under extreme pressure from members of his party and the other party to stop the spread of communism even further. Mao makes communism look like it's on the march. So what is his vision for China? Well, whatever vision Mao comes up with, and we're going to explore that in some detail here, but whatever vision that he has is going to be colored by this one inescapable and somewhat intractable problem. It's a question. Can a rural nation of peasant farmers achieve communism? That is a very open question, because this is not how Marx said it would happen. Marx, in his writings, if you go back to the 1840s and 50s and 60s, he says, communism is going to happen, the revolution is going to happen in the industrialized nation. It's going to be the exploited industrial worker, the proletariat. They're going to rise up and overthrow their bourgeois factory owners, and that's going to be the transition. But communism didn't happen like that. First it happens in Russia in the 19-teens and 20s, and then it happens in China. Both largely underdeveloped, largely rural, largely agrarian populations. So Mao sets out to answer this question by saying, the communism that we build in China is going to be built around agriculture. And it's going to be built around this idea of communal farming. We're going to get rid of the private farms, the individual plots of land, and we're going to pool them together. And we're going to use the collective power of the people. We're going to share the tractors, the farming implements. We're going to cooperate in these big communes, no longer little family units or even small village units. We're going to become communal farming operations. And historically, this is going to uproot a lot of stuff. Traditionally, China's farming had been controlled by the landlord class. Even if you go back to the ancient Chinese emperors, you go up through the warlords, the Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, the landlord feudal class still controlled much of the interior of China. Mao says you got to get rid of them. If the revolution's going to succeed, if communism's going to succeed, the landlords must fail. They have to be gotten rid of, and they're going to do some pretty dramatic things to make that happen. And here's the second, and I think more interesting and emotional point. Mao says if we're going to reform agriculture and we're going to have communal farming, we need to rely on the power of the peasants. You'll notice there's a consistent story in Mao's life and career. Whenever he's backed into a corner, whenever he doesn't have an answer for a revolutionary problem, he goes back to the peasants. Power of the peasants. He says in his book of quotations by Chairman Mao, most commonly held book, published book in world history, because every Chinese citizen is going to have one, especially during Mao's rule. He has this interesting quote: "We must have faith, first in the peasant masses. They're ready to advance step by step along the road of socialism under the leadership of the party, and second, that the party's capable of leading the peasants along this road. These 2 points are the essence of the matter, the main current." Just think back to Mao's life. If you lived through the Long March and that long, bloody civil war, it was the peasants. Think back to your reading, Rival Chinese Leaders. It was the peasants that Mao appealed to. They were the core of his support. He's going back to them again. Mao's vision also entails gender equality. This is something that many communist movements are going to do when they take power. They're going to try to take the labor of women out of the household, out of the raising of children and household chores, and it's going to try to put it into the rest of the tasks of the economy, whether it's farming or industrial agriculture. Many women are going to get jobs working for the Communist Party, which is, again, if you're a woman who's been isolated to the household, this is going to be a liberating experience. So Mao's going to push gender equality. Mrs. Shires talked about this on Friday. I'm just going to state it again. Mao says if we follow his program, there will be 5 guarantees. This is his quote-unquote sales pitch to the Chinese. Follow me, and there will be food, housing, clothing, education, and medical care. This is what communism can deliver on. It's the very essence of what communism promises. Everybody's needs are going to be taken care of, regardless of class. Class is going to be undone. So, I want to stop here. You have these struggle sessions as a way of kind of deposing the landlords and putting China on the path to communal reform in agriculture. This is Mao's vision. And you have these humiliating scenes that we see here. These are landlords, or they could be Communist Party officials who are later going to be criticized for not fully implementing Mao's goals. The Chinese Revolution and Maoist China is very rich in propaganda posters. This is not even scratching the surface of them. There are thousands of them. The goal, remember, is to put the Chinese peasants in charge of the land and get them to do incredible things. These propaganda posters, kind of an odd pairing of things. You're riding a tractor through an ocean being divided. If you look closely, there's a guy riding a rocket in the background, giving like a, hey, look at us, we're achieving great things. You have this sort of idealized vision of the Chinese family under Mao. We've seen these types of images before in propaganda posters. They're gathered around. You've got the portrait of Mao going on there. Peaceful, idyllic, everybody's taken care of. But as we're going to see, Mao's program is going to put some major strains on the family as well. So, continuing with Mao's vision for China, he believes in this idea of struggle sessions. This is at the core of communist ideology, which is that you need to get people conscious of their class and get them to overthrow their former leaders, their former rulers in the capitalist world. It's a form of public humiliation. You discredit landlords, you can discredit Communist Party officials, and you strengthen the masses through this process, as messy as it is. Mao's, one of his core beliefs and his core sayings that he'll always repeat to party officials, and he'll use this to berate party officials as well: serve the people. Individual needs are less important than the needs of society. This is going to be an idea that not only Marxists are going to have, but you're going to have much more of a push throughout China for the good of the group and de-emphasizing the importance of the individual and selfish pursuits. An early program that Mao launches to make this happen, and it is telling for what it does and how it results and what's going to happen in the future. He launches what's called the 100 Flowers campaign. I mean, who could be against 100 flowers? Sounds wonderful. Sounds delightful. From 1956 to 1957, Mao wants to enlist the cooperation and the ideas of China's intellectual class. So he famously says, let 100 flowers bloom, as a way of metaphorically saying, let's share ideas. Let's get everybody to kind of share out, and we're going to take the best from everybody. So it's a campaign that actually invites criticism of the government. It tells the intellectuals, it tells the local Communist Party officials, it tells whoever has an idea in China to share it out, to criticize. But what Mao begins to find is that people take him really seriously, and they start doing so, and they start relentlessly attacking the communist government, and they begin to start attacking Mao. And Mao, for many of his other qualities, he doesn't take really well to criticism, political criticism, and it eventually is halted by Mao. He shuts down dissent. He shuts down the disagreement. And this is going to be a kind of forerunner to what comes in the future. So Mao does come up with an economic program. His signature economic program is what is called, and I bolded this, you should know what this is, the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward, it's a massive, if you want a definition, it's a massive economic program favored by Mao, pushed in the Communist Party, to industrialize China and collectivize agriculture in China, to bring it all under collectivization, no longer small private landlord plots, from 1958 to 62. It's going to organize China into communal production. It forbids private production. It's all going to be done to produce for the state. And he calls it the Great Leap Forward because it's symbolically China's great leap in terms of economic production to catch up with the rest of the world. There's a lot of untapped potential in China. It's a big country. It's got lots of natural resources. Mao says, let's bring this all online. Let's bring this all to bear for the benefit of the state and to serve the people. Mao also sets out on this Great Leap Forward, and you're going to see this in the footage we see. He wants people to feel they have a stake in China. And if you can get them to do small, tiny acts of contributions, and some of them will be kind of ridiculous here, but through these small acts of everybody contributing, even tiny children, Mao believes you'll make them feel a stake in China, and people can move mountains if they feel as though they have this connection. Some examples, which you're going to see in the film clip here. To generate and boost steel production in China, which is essential for industry and military purposes, he urges the collecting of all scrap metals. And to encourage people to participate, he encourages people to create essentially what are backyard steel furnaces. Mud, stone, brick furnaces that you literally build by the dozens in your village that can melt down all forms of scrap steel. People are going to even show up with their cooking woks to melt down. He creates communal mess halls. No longer are you going to dine and eat with your family unit. You're going to eat in these big cafeteria-like structures that every village in China is going to create. Big communal mess halls, and this kind of contributes to that tension within the family. This is going to be unsettling for some of you. He launches what's called the Four Pests campaign. It's believed by Mao that agriculture is being held back through disease and pests. Some of these are sparrows, which feast on grain of all sorts and mess up the harvest. Flies, mosquitoes, and rats. These are pests that Mao believes needs to be eliminated. So they launched this campaign. And before we go to the film clip, I just want to show you, this is a picture of the Four Pests, or a poster from the Four Pests campaign, of this knife impaling a mosquito, a fly, a sparrow, and a rat. And it's going to be taken to the extreme here. Here's an image of the backyard furnaces. This is a guy who's putting scrap metal in, and you got another guy stoking it. You'll have another guy blowing oxygen on it. This is a kind of propaganda poster from the Great Leap Forward of people coming together to achieve great things. So on one hand, the Great Leap and Mao's vision, it achieves amazing feats in terms of getting people to accomplish tasks and to work together. The question is it really yielding anything valuable? And the unfortunate answer for Mao is that the Great Leap Forward is largely a disaster. Here are some reasons why the Great Leap Forward is problematic. Number one, there are faulty manufacturing techniques. If you're doing backyard steel furnaces, there is a level of expertise in the manufacture of steel, especially on a broad scale, and steel that can be used for industrial purposes, that you're not going to achieve. So there's just that technical problem there. It also, when you put millions of people to work in their own homespun activities, you're going to misuse and you're going to waste labor in ways that a market economy doesn't. Where in a market economy, labor goes to where it can be most rewarded and most productive. Here, in many cases, the Communist Party is just gathering up people. It's redirecting doctors to stoke furnaces. Little children are in charge of tasks. It's not a proper use of labor, and it's not going to always yield the best results for the task at hand. There's some social tensions that come out of this. We talked about this a little before. But the Great Leap breaks up a lot of family norms. Like, for instance, while on one hand, many women see it as a real opportunity to get out of the household, it breaks up a lot of the traditional living in the family unit and meals around the table. Even elderly people, grandparents, who traditionally had been tasked with looking after young children. This was like something you expected of the elderly, still, even to this day. They are sent to, and I'm not making this up, they're sent to what are called happiness homes as a way of kind of enjoying their golden years, and they're no longer tasked with watching children who can be sent to nurseries and schools. There's also the problem of people are just straight up lying. They're exaggerating and inflating and falsifying their numbers because there's a drive, there's an incentive that if you're the local village Communist Party leader, you want to make it look as though your village is accomplishing a lot. So you're going to lie to your higher-ups about how much steel you made, how much rice you were producing, and then that lie is going to be passed up the chain of command, and it's going to be all this bad information flow. The result is tragic, and that is mass starvation is going to occur that has not been eclipsed in that many instances. Somewhere around, and the estimates are today, over 30 million people are going to starve to death because of this economic mismanagement. You're going to get situations where the government expects this much rice crop to be produced or this much steel, and it's going to take that amount, and if there's nothing left over for that village to survive upon, they don't have enough to survive, and they die. To add kind of insult to injury here, Mao is going to refuse to accept any sort of blame for this. And at one point, he's even going to deny to other world leaders that there's even a famine in China. He's going to turn this around on Communist Party officials, looking at these failures to say, it's not because I'm not doing my job, you're not doing your job. Why are these Communist Party officials not preparing the people? Why are we not utilizing the will of the peasants? And he will at one point threaten that he will go out into the countryside and lead a peasant army again. He's done it before, against the government bureaucrats. I want to just read you this quote. We're not going to analyze it, but I want to read it to you just so it sinks in and conveys the situation that was created by this Great Leap Forward. This is from a historian of modern China. People, including those in leadership circles, were fearful of punishment. Comrade Li asked whether production projections are too high. He must be a rightist. This was a slam against somebody who was in the Communist Party. If you called them a rightist, you were essentially calling them a capitalist. Mr. Zhang questioned the validity of impossibly high harvest reports. He surely is a weak-kneed rightist. Comrade Shen asked whether water projects carried out so swiftly and constructed with untrained workers would function properly. He dares to question the will and power of the people. He is clearly an elitist, a rightist, and a counter-revolutionary. In other words, building on a series of political campaigns and terror related to those campaigns, Mao had created an ongoing situation that saw honest questioning and honest disagreement as evidence that questioners and those who disagreed were enemies and traitors to the revolution. Just to show you a picture here, that dip you see on the far left, that is the Chinese birth rate during the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962. Later on, their birth rate's going to collapse after the one-child policy. So let's step away from the Chinese domestic scene, what's going on inside of China, and let's look at what's going on in foreign policy during Mao's time. When he takes power, there's a lot of hope within the communist world that these two superpowers now, although China wasn't exactly a superpower militarily at the moment, but coupled with the Soviet Union, they can do amazing things, and this will invigorate the communist world. So Mao is going to be teamed up with Joseph Stalin, who's the leader of the Soviet Union, when he takes power. And this is a big fear, especially in the United States. Well, as it turns out, this relationship does not flower, does not flourish. In fact, it really kind of collapses very early on. Initially, Mao looks to the Soviet Union for financial and technical and industrial support, which we all know China needs at the time. You saw the situation Mao inherits. He's looking for help where he can get it. But the Soviet Union kind of sees itself in a paternalistic way. It wants to have China do things the way it wants to do, and Mao, for his part, has his own vision for what he wants to achieve with China. He's not a nobody. He survived the Long March. He survived the revolution. He overcame odds. So he didn't take real well to the kind of condescending attitude the Soviet Union would take to him, and vice versa. Mao favors more confrontation with the capitalist world. Even goes as far as to favor, or at least openly consider, nuclear war. And I'm going to read you this very chilling quote in a second. Mao favors this confrontation. It's one of the reasons he chooses to support North Korea, another communist power, much smaller, that is adjacent to China. Mao sends hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops to support North Korea in its war against the South and the United States and the United Nations. Something around 500,000 Chinese soldiers are going to die helping to prop up North Korea in the Korean War, 1950-53. At the time, after the death of Stalin, who dies in 1952, the Soviets start to move more towards cooperation and coexistence with the United States. There's going to be some tense moments, to be sure, after that, but they're going to begin to be a little bit more open to cooperation with the capitalist world. Mao says, no, we don't need that. We need confrontation. I'm playing a long game, and that long game is that communism succeeds. And cooperation, coexistence, that doesn't get us there. And for their part, the Soviet Union feels Mao has totally mismanaged the potential of the Chinese economy. They look at the Great Leap Forward, and they see disaster, disaster, disaster. Mao misunderstands. He rejects our help. He rejects our advice. Why are we propping this guy up? They see it as a misuse of their technical assistance. By the mid-1950s, the Soviets are promising Mao that they're going to give him nuclear weapons, and they're going to outfit him with uranium enrichment facilities, and China's going to be on the path to being a nuclear power. They're giving them tractors and all sorts of agricultural support, and they see themselves as innovators in this. The Soviets do. And then they look at the Great Leap Forward, and you can only imagine what they're thinking when they see backyard furnaces. We're giving you technical support, we're putting you on the path to nuclear weapons, and you're telling your people you need backyard furnaces, and you're killing sparrows. This is how the Soviets see Mao. So I said I've got a chilling quote for you here. This is, and we're going to analyze this one. So your task is going to be to generate a summary sentence. You can work with someone around you, but I want to read it to you here. Mao says this in 1958 to the 8th Party Congress of the Communist Party in China. If nuclear war breaks out, it is unavoidable that people will die. We've seen wars kill people. Many times in China's past, half the population has been wiped out. We've at present no experience with atomic war. We do not know how many must die. It is better if 1/2 are left, and the second best is 1/3. After several 5-year plans, China will then develop and rise up. In place of the totally destroyed capitalism, we will obtain perpetual peace. This will not be a bad thing. This is Mao in 1958, talking about nuclear war. I want you to take 2 minutes, generate a summary sentence, and we're going to share out what we find. So Joseph Stalin and Mao, they never really get off the ground in their relationship. It's said that Stalin is insulting to Mao early on. Mao doesn't very much care for Stalin. He doesn't like the idea, the way he's treated when he goes to the Soviet Union, and they're essentially taking a very paternalistic, you're going to do it this way, we're going to give you materials, but you're going to kind of follow our directives. So there might have been some personal problems there, but Stalin dies in March of 1952, and they never really get a chance to really have a close working relationship. Mao does develop some sort of a relationship with Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor in the Soviet Union. And they don't really get along. They look like they're having fun here with a pack of cigarettes in the front. But in reality, it's the same kind of message. Mao feels the Soviets are treating China like children, like junior partners, when he wants to see them as equal partners, if not leaders. Remember, China is under Mao. Has a lot of potential. It can be unleashed, economically, politically, militarily, and he doesn't want to look at the Soviet Union as this older brother figure that tells them what to do. The Korean War, remember I said Mao commits hundreds of thousands of troops to prop up North Korea? Just to give you a quick image of what that entailed, it meant that China came to bat, essentially, for the North, and was willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives. And again, this is part of Mao's long game. He was willing to risk nuclear war. He was willing to prop up North Korea. Remember, he wanted to be confrontational with the capitalist world. You don't win by playing nice. That wasn't how Mao defeated Chiang, and he wasn't going to change his ways now. He will later on in life, oddly enough. Final slide here. And I just want to introduce you to this term, so don't feel like you need to get everything, but it's going to be the topic of tomorrow and Thursday. If the revolution was Mao's first act in his life, to put it in theater terms, if the revolution was Mao's first act, and the Great Leap Forward and his consolidation of power in China was his second, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was his third act, you might say. So what was it? We're going to talk more about this in small group tomorrow and on Thursday. It's a social and political campaign launched by Mao to reinvigorate communism in China. Communist beliefs, commitment to the ideology, commitment to remaking China. From the mid-1960s until his death in 1976, although he's going to scale it back a little bit in the final years. Here's the context that this Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution comes out of. Mao had lost standing because of the Great Leap Forward. Massive economic failure, 30 million people died, largely because of his economic program. So Mao has to try to figure out how to gain power back in the Communist Party. And he decides to turn to the people of China, who still see him as that legend who pulled off the revolution against all odds. So he's going to tell the youth of China, rise up against the authority figures. Whether it's your teachers, leaders in the Communist Party, whoever it is, rise up, and he's going to outfit them, and the Communist Party is going to outfit them with these little red books. I have a copy right here, the Quotations of Chairman Mao. And students would assiduously read these and quote these back ad nauseum as a way of demonstrating their commitment to communism. It allows Mao to mobilize the population and to frighten his enemies. The one thing, stick with me, you've got 30 seconds to a minute. The one thing Mao has going for him at this point in his life is he's still a legend in China. And he can still call upon the Chinese people to do great things. And he's even willing to utilize them to threaten the Communist Party as a way of winning back power. That's the proletarian cultural revolution. We'll talk about that next coming